Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to speak to you today. Many thanks to the Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership for inviting me to take part. It's fitting that we're using virtual technology because the theme of this event is how we can do things differently as we emerge from the COVID crisis. For decades, we've been hearing how digital technologies and video conferencing would replace the need for business meetings. But for various reasons, the technology never really caught on. It's taken just 4 months of coronavirus lockdown for that to change, to alter our perceptions of how businesses and people can stay in touch. And it's brought real benefits. By not physically meeting for this low carbon conference, I wonder how much carbon we've saved. At a time when we're urging people to avoid public transport, I wonder how many journeys we've saved. Coronavirus has changed us, just as it's changed our world. And that gives us a unique opportunity within transport to rethink the way that we travel, to speed up the development of clean technologies, and to put green recovery at the heart of our plans for the future. Now, part of the opportunity is to shift opinions, to impress on the country that the green transport revolution, which we've been talking about for many years, is actually happening now. Some of the transformational improvements are literally within touching distance. Our £2 billion investment programme to boost cycling and walking, for example, and our work with councils to redesign the street landscape so they can cope with millions more bikes and pedestrians. These are sensible, practical measures that not only keep people off public transport and prevent the spread of the virus, but also improve the health of the nation. But there's also an opportunity for us to reframe the narrative around green cars, vans, buses and trucks to show that it is this generation that will drive the transition away from fossil fuels to zero carbon road transport. A revolution no less historic than the coming of the railways or commercial aviation. And that's something that we will do together, government, industry and academia. Just as we've done since the Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership was founded 17 years ago. For all that time, the partnership's name has reflected the work it's been doing, supporting the development and use of low carbon vehicles on Britain's roads. But low carbon vehicles are no longer our goal. We have to decarbonise road transport altogether and demonstrate that both government and industry are united in our commitment to achieve that goal. So let me float the idea that maybe now is a good time to consider a new name for the partnership. The name's important, but it's nothing if it's not backed with action. So in months ahead, we will see the government putting its full weight behind the Net Zero campaign, behind rebuilding our infrastructure, investing in modern transport connections, and scaling up ambitions as we work towards our full transport decarbonisation plan later this year. I hope you've seen that we've not been wasting our time whilst battling the virus. I've had the privilege to host 6 of the Downing Street press conferences since March, which has provided a fantastic platform to talk about the importance of green transport and to get on with delivering it. Let me just remind you of what we've announced. As well as cycling and walking funding, we've revealed plans to roll out 4,000 new zero-emission buses across the country and to establish the first UK all-hydrogen bus town. £12 million funding to develop the zero-emissions vehicles of the future and new charging infrastructure technologies to help more drivers go electric. £10 million to install up to 7,200 more on-street charge points. Plans to introduce green number plates for zero-emission cars, vans and trucks, which will raise awareness and help owners benefit from incentive schemes like cheaper parking for greener vehicles. Fast-track trials to make e-scooters available as quickly as possible across the country. And just the other week, I hosted the first meeting of the Net Zero Transport Board, hearing from the UK's experts on how we can best tackle emissions across the transport sector. All this comes on top of what we're doing before coronavirus even struck, through our £2.5 billion programme to tackle road transport emissions from motorcycles to the biggest HGVs. But we can achieve nothing without collaboration, without the extraordinary array of businesses, academic, environmental institutions that make up the Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership. Our vehicle manufacturers, our technology developers, our fuel industries, our designers, engineers, our universities, who have made the remarkable progress in developing and selling greener vehicles in recent years, and the infrastructure on which they rely. Over 200 member organisations providing open and independent advice that informs government policy and that also allows our essential exchange of views on how we meet our shared objectives. Together, we've broken down barriers and boundaries with the Electric Vehicle Energy Task Force. We've established a robust scheme for retrofit accreditation. We've launched information campaigns to help the consumer understand changing fuel and vehicle technologies. And we will continue to work closely together to deliver zero carbon mass motoring and improve the charging experience. Just as important is commercial transport, not least freight and long-haul trucks, where LowCVP has been instrumental in overseeing testing to help us better understand the innovative technology within the tech sector. I also want to commend the partnership for the work it's done on buses, which has helped establish the bus industry as a zero carbon leader, an example for others to follow throughout other sectors. It's work that is literally saving lives as the air in our towns and cities becomes less polluted. The past few months have been amongst the most challenging for our country and incredibly tough for many members of the Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership. But I'm optimistic about the future. We have a history in our nation of driving change in transport. When we invented the railway, when we launched the jet age aviation, thanks to our brilliant engineers and our entrepreneurs, cutting edge technologies and supportive governments combining to bring about radical change. And now we stand on the verge of a new revolution, a green transport revolution, driven by the partnership I've spoken of today. So I can't wait to work with you, to bring that future forward, to create something extraordinary, and to put green transport at the heart of our recovery. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you to the Secretary of State for that wide-ranging update on the progress the government has made towards its road transport decarbonisation strategy, and indeed the many announcements that we've seen in recent weeks in trying to embed green transport behaviours during this crisis. As mentioned, I think we're inviting questions from the stage, and I think if I can invite Dr. Bob Moran from the Dept to join us. We can present some of the questions to him from yourselves and hopefully get a bit more in-depth response on Dept's current thinking on this most important topic. Bob, good to see you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you.
Brilliant. It all seems to be working nicely. Everyone. Excellent. Well, yeah, no, thank you very much for joining us. For those who don't know, Bob is Head of Environment Strategy at Dept, having previously worked at the Office for Low Emission Vehicles. He is obviously an expert in all things of the road transport decarbonisation agenda. Bob, first question, I suppose, just from myself, do you think there's been a bit of a shift within Dept in its engagement with this whole net zero agenda in the last 6 months, and how much has the sort of the coronavirus crisis maybe really focused minds on the scale of the net zero transition that's required in the sector?
Yeah, thanks, James. I think not just in the last 6 months, but I can talk a little bit about the change in emphasis over that time. But I think if you go back to the launch of the IPCC report and the ministers in government then, I think that was the big shift that happened. And in transport, the ministers that were there at the time, so Secretary of State was Chris Grayling, and all the senior officials and the entire department really took a good look at that report, and things started to change from that moment on. I think the scale of the challenge, we've set the challenge with the Decarbonising Transport document that we published in March, but the scale of the challenge, I think, became very evident, and the potential catastrophe that a lack of action would mean for all of us, I think, was struck home, really. And I think for a long time in transport, we'd kind of hadn't answered the question when people had said, you're the biggest emitters of carbon and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, but we're doing all this good stuff. I think at that point we finally said, yeah, we are, and we've got to do something about it. So the change started happening, I think, a couple of years ago. It's come to fruition a little bit in what we've started in the last 6 months. But I think, as the Secretary of State said, this is the start, very much not the end by any means. We haven't done anything yet in many ways. This is a start.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that message has cut through with the many stakeholders for you? I mean, obviously the industry, the auto industry as a primary one, but then obviously the public as a whole. Virtually everyone engages with road transport in one description or other. Do you think that the understanding of how big and how fast these changes are going to have to be, as the Secretary of State said there, this is as big as the coming of the railways, of the invention of the internal combustion engine. Within a decade, within 2 parliaments, we will have really fundamentally transformed the way we all get around. Do you think that's really cut through? And if not, which is slightly where the question is going, what more needs to be done to ensure that industry and public are engaged?
Yeah, I think it's cut through in parts, and I think we saw a big change with the direct action last year and Extinction Rebellion, and cut through to the public. I mean, we lucky in some respects, but I get to see a lot of ministerial correspondence on this issue, and so the change in tone of the letters around that time was quite dramatic and significant. There's a lot more to be done. I think with the decarbonisation plan and the path we're trying to take to create it, we're determined to start a different kind of conversation, and that's with stakeholders and industry, but as well with the public. And so I think there is a lot more to do to cut through. And yeah, in essence, no, I don't think so. So I think there are still many people who don't quite understand the enormity of the change, the transformation, the real transformation on road transport that is going to come through very, very quickly. And I think we're only a few months away, we're only a couple of years away from being in a very different kind of situation and having a very different kind of conference to the one we've got today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The change is going to be rapid, I suspect. We've got many questions from the floor that people want to ask. A couple of them touching on the thorny topic of the road building programme. So several along similar lines. Gillian Enable has asked, 2 weeks before the Department for Transport published the plan for cutting emissions, you also published the biggest roads programme ever, and ministers proudly trumpet that. There's been a report that said that could wipe out 80% of the emission savings from EVs, which I understand Dept rejected as wholly inaccurate. Can you give us a bit more sense of how you square that massive road building programme with the need to decarbonise? Yeah,
okay then. So I think it's one of balance, and we think the package, the 27 billion on is well balanced. There is a determined and a quite specific plan for decarbonisation within that. A lot of and improvements that will benefit public transport, and improvements that will be funded through the RIS2 programme that will support cyclists, and hopefully more space for cycling through that programme. Junction improvements, all of that kind of stuff. It lends itself to environmental improvements as well as more tarmac. To be honest, since the lockdown, then I think a lot of people have questioned whether we should go ahead with that programme and whatnot. We've had a look at it. We've looked at forecasts. I think I was in a conversation the other day, and somebody said it's the $1 million question now, isn't it? What's going to happen? Are people going to return to their offices in town centres? What's going to happen to traffic? At the moment, we think it's going to bounce back over what type of period. We're not quite sure, but it is. So the RIS2 funding and the investment is still warranted in that respect.
Does that suggest that if that modelling's proved to be wrong in say a year, 2 years time, that it isn't bouncing back as strongly, then there could be more of a case for rethink. I mean, but Doug Parr has asked, is there not a stranded asset risk here now that even if, say, 20–30% of people don't come back to travelling as much as they would, then you could end up with overcapacity?
Gosh, overcapacity. That would be. It's an interest. It's interesting. It's interesting. I see. It's interesting walking around the streets. So I live in central London, and I, experienced the very empty roads quite quickly. Then the increase in cyclists, and now kind of some of the kind of frustration of some drivers with cyclists or the extra space being given over. I can see that on the streets outside. But in actual fact, that's improving congestion, and journey times all around London are actually improving with more people cycling. So I think it's important that schemes get looked at, as they will do through this package, each in turn, and we've got to keep an eye on what happens. We were very quick in transport, in the Department of Transport, to start some new science projects and some research projects as soon as lockdown hit. So within the space of a few hours, we'd started collecting data to understand what people were doing, what changes we were seeing, and we're going to keep those going. So I would guess that, I'm not a politician, I'm a civil servant, but I'm sure that politicians and those ministers in transport will want to take a look at this if things change, if things are different in the future. I'm sure they would. It's a lot of money, which
Yeah, no, absolutely. Got quite a few questions I want to rattle through, so I'm just trying to get through a few of them as quickly as we can. James Beard has asked has noted that today there were over 20 businesses, big businesses, have called on the government to come forward with a more ambitious strategy for 2030 being the sales target date to end the sale of petrol and diesel cars, backed up by stronger policies on supply, demand, and charging infrastructure. These big corporates want this to move faster. Firstly, what's your response to that call? And secondly, how will the phase-out consultation and the new CO2 standards consultation interact so that we're on a sort of a smooth path to get to the zero emissions as quickly as possible?
Yeah, so they're reasonably well aligned, those two processes. It's slightly different people leading each. The consultation's open until the end of July, so I couldn't presume to understand, or make a claim for knowing the full detail of what that's going to set out. I think what you will see. Well, let's look at the Committee on Climate Change's report, the annual report, just out a few weeks ago. I've been in the Department of Transport a long time, looking at the CCC report every year, feeling upset at the red crosses every year. But this time, we were nearly okay in a lot of areas, so it was more positive. It's a more positive reaction than what we've seen in the past. So the CCC, it's very difficult at the moment for the government to not do what the CCC are suggesting. And I noticed that the CCC have come forward and said, well, it should be 2032 at the latest, actually. Back when we came out with 2035 at the latest, that was the CCC's line. So we'll have to see. I can't presume to know what the consultation is going to say, but we are consulting on 2035 or earlier if feasible. And if businesses come forward and say it's possible and needed, then I'm sure that ministers will want to understand that.
And one of the questions from earlier in the day, do you have a view on how plug-in hybrids could fit into that or not?
Yeah, that will be submit your evidence on the longevity of hybrids, I think, through the consultation process. But I think the Secretary of State was quite clear in his message. We're heading to zero. Net zero in 2050 doesn't mean a get out of jail card for anybody involved in road transport. I don't think it is zero emissions, and the quicker we move and the quicker we get there, the more benefits we all enjoy.
Yeah. One of the other questions we've had earlier that's reiterated here by Mike Sutton is, given that all vehicles have emissions from their life cycle, would it be useful to stop using the phrase zero emissions vehicles, as it's not true? It's zero emissions at tailpipe, and that could shift our thinking towards more efficient ways of managing managing how we use transport.
Okay. Life cycle analysis of all aspects of transport is not something that we ignore or hide from. It is zero emission at the tailpipe measure at the moment, but we are heading to a net zero economy, and those emissions will all be factored in. At the moment, in terms of driving technology and the market, I think zero emissions, using the term zero emissions and zero emission at point of use, is the right thing to do. We work very, very closely in transport with colleagues in BEIS and the energy sector, and it's such a huge element of the work that we've got now. If you bring forward from 2040 then to 2035, a phase out date to 2030, yes, huge impact on consumers and the way they use cars, but actually a massive impact then on infrastructure and on the energy networks in the UK. The investments that we know we need to make, they may well have to come forward or change.
Yeah, absolutely. A question here from Kit Harbottle, who's asked, what is the department doing to ensure that it's working with your colleagues in planning policy and the Department for Housing to ensure that electric vehicle transport is properly integrated with new homes, and there's planning together that communities can support this type of technology, and we're not left with what we're seeing a lot of at the moment, where people kind of need to use their cars even for short trips because of the way new estates are being developed.
Yeah, so that's part of what we're doing with the Transport Decarb Plan, tackling that, working with our colleagues in MHCLG. On planning, we know that that's a huge lever that up until now in transport we haven't really got a hold of, but we have now, and so we're on it. The problem of locking in car dependence into a lot of new housing developments and locations is one that's very at the forefront of transport ministers' minds, as well as those in MHCLG.
And I have a Brexit question. It wouldn't be it's quite nice to discuss Brexit after the last 6 months, to be honest, but going back to it, obviously the Department for Transport announced on Tuesday to replace EU car CO2 regulations with new targets that look marginally weaker than what we have from the EU. How does the department plan to phase out cars with engines by 2035 at the latest? At the latest, as EU targets will only require around a third zero-emission vehicles by 2030. And also, how will the government penalise OEMs if they don't meet emissions targets post-2020, given we'll be outside the EU regime?
Yeah. Okay. Really good question, actually. Yeah, I think it's worth saying, back when we were in the EU, because obviously we have left now, when we negotiated the last set of targets, I was there with ministers, and they were genuinely disappointed with the ambition that was shown from a lot of our fellow member states at that point. So with the powers that we've got, all we can do now at the end of the transition period is carry across and correct, basically, to make the EU regulations function in a national setting. The fines will be applied on manufacturers pretty much as previously, but ministers have kept on reconfirming that. I think most recently in the Net Zero Transport Board last week, Minister McLean, who's responsible for the regulations, did say that we're going to be at least as ambitious in the future, and to be credible and to deliver on the phase out dates, whether it's 2035 or 2032 or earlier. Then I think you're looking at some form of regulation in the future. And at the moment, you would say that the EU CO2 regs brought across ain't going to cut it.
And just finally, to ask you to look into your crystal ball, what does a net zero transport system look like? I mean, you within 20 years, you'll still be around to see it. Fingers crossed, we all will. What will it look and feel like for the public and for the industry?
Do you know what? I was around when we started negotiating the CO2 regulations in the EU, and there were some near-term targets and then some long-term targets for 2020. And I would never have imagined that I would still be around to be working with them right now. I hope I'm still around in 2050. I think it's. I think I would say it's a lot like the vision we've tried to set out in the decarbonising transport setting the challenge document. It's a vision we share with ministers right now. Active travel, delivering all of the benefits of walking and cycling for people's health and the nation's health and the environment. I think that's the area for me where I hope that we have done our job properly, and in the future. The environmental impact of transport is vastly reduced, and transport is not something that detracts from the world around us. Is something that we just get on with, and we don't notice. So I think for me that's the heart of it. In terms of technology, then I think technology too often is the kind of get out. The get out for a minute. I'm sure there'll be fantastic things flying around, delivering things to us far quicker, using ridiculously small-sized batteries to travel from here to Australia. I don't know. Who knows? Who knows? Really, really exciting. But I think the thing to get right, and the thing that we are most concentrated on right now, is putting active travel and public transport. We've got to get buses and mass transit back operating again. But we've got to make that really the heart of transport policy now, and take that through the next decade.
Excellent, really encouraging to hear. Thank you very much, Bob, for your time, and thank you for everyone for their questions. And sorry I wasn't able to get through all of them. We now shift to Andy Eastlake, who is back to give the LowCVP's response to the Secretary of State's speech, and also offer his perspective on the next steps for the decarbonisation plan. So, Andy, there you are. You are indeed back, and I will disappear for a few moments, and the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, James. I mean, he's doing such a good job, isn't he? I'm sitting there backstage with all the chats going on various systems and things. I'm just very pleased that the video conference industry aren't building cars for us at the moment. So what we want to do is, and I'm going to trim my thoughts a little bit in trying to keep us on time. But looking at the people that we've got online, there's actually quite a few familiar faces and quite a number of people that I think were with us, Phil and myself and others, back in 2003 when this was all launched in Millbank Tower, down in the centre of London, just around the corner from where Bob is, I think. And actually, that was when we set this agenda, the low carbon agenda. And we heard from the Secretary of State that actually low is not good enough now. I think just reflecting on that, low then was 100 grams per kilometre tailpipe. And we hoped that we might get for that to be 10% of the sales within 10 years. This was indeed also before the Climate Change Act, and our role as the LowCVP was laid out, and it was to reduce the greenhouse gas impact of road transport. And then, of course, it was only responsible for about 22% of the UK's total greenhouse gas. Now it's a significantly larger proportion, and clearly now, as we've heard from the Secretary of State, the aim is not to actually reduce, it's to remove carbon from transport. And the LowCVP has got to respond to that and to bring ourselves focused on the net zero future. But I think one of the questions and one of the things that we grapple with in the LowCVP is what really is zero. And I think that's some of the questions that we've seen coming through on the chat actually do get to some of the key questions that we like to grapple with. Is net zero tailpipe, as we've articulated at the moment? Is it zero well to wheel? Is it zero life cycle or zero greenhouse gas? Or indeed, is it zero impact on a complete sustainability perspective? And some of my colleagues and some of the work that we've been doing, Gloria's been leading work with the APC on some of these aspects. And it's certainly things that we believe need to be progressed as we move down this challenge towards zero. But I think what's really important is that it's not just us saying that. And I want to share a couple of slides from the survey that we've been running, just to give you a flavour of what's going out there. We will actually get the survey. We'll continue to keep the survey open, and we'll be reporting those results. But hopefully you can see a slide now that just gives us a couple of flavours. And I took this back at the end of last night, so it was about 200 odd inputs to the process. And the first thing that came out of the survey from my perspective, and we looked at, is now the right moment? And our stakeholder group overwhelmingly said, yes, now is the time to move. Now is the time for us to be grabbing this nettle, picking up the gauntlet, whatever you want to do, to actually move decarbonisation of road transport forward. But also, there was a real appetite and a real appreciation that the public will accept more radical and more effective, more ambitious policy. Over 85%, 84% of the stakeholders suggested that now is the time and we need to be bold. I think importantly, and hopefully you'll see a little bit later on, that actually there is no silver bullet. When we asked the question about what has the greatest potential, Bob picked up on active travel, demand reduction we've heard about, mass adoption of zero emission vehicles, The introduction and adoption of low carbon fuels is a key area. And actually, the feedback we got was that all of those are broadly equally important. So there is no silver bullet. I think another key aspect that came out from the report and from the survey was that we are actually all here to help. Some of the questions just earlier, we had a call that the government needs to do more, it needs more incentives, more grants, more infrastructure. Well, actually, we are all in this together. And there is an appetite, I think, post-COVID now that people understand and reflect that, in fact, we will all have to change aspects of what we do. There's got to be a steer from government, of course, but there may need to be some painful choices in order to encourage us or to make those economies work in the way that we need to do, even to the extent of ditching the car. And I think just picking up one of the questions that James touched on as well was around the 27 billion, this 27 billion that was lauded before the lockdown and is certainly being questioned now. When we questioned our stakeholder group, in fact, 77% said, yes, that 27 billion might be better allocated to other applications. Fibre broadband has been suggested by the CCC, but clean vehicle infrastructure, demand reduction, modal shift measures, all of these other tools that are in the box, given the changes in travel habits that we're seeing, might actually warrant a bigger slice of the pie. And I think within that, spending money and carrying these things out, there is a real ambition and, to my mind, a real excitement about this being a win-win opportunity. The clear majority said that if we apply these policies correctly, actually the economy and the environment can both really succeed and really progress with a green recovery approach. So there's no doubt that we actually have a view from the stakeholders that we can build better, not necessarily more, and that green recovery is the way to think about this. And I think one of the points that I wanted to get across was actually about our ambition. I mentioned it right at the start, but we have a history of exceeding our ambition. And I think it's really important to understand that and to reflect back on that. Back in 2013, the government projected this graph around the uptake of ultra-low emission vehicles. And at the time, there was much wringing of hands and is it possible? And you can see that, the general trend was we might be at 5%. Year to date, we're 7.7% ultra-low emission vehicles in the UK, halfway through 2020. Granted, it's an abnormal year, and there have been some bulges in deliveries and things like that. But actually, our car fleet is changing faster than maybe we anticipated or we thought was possible 7 or 8 years ago. And when you look at the other sectors, because it's not all about cars, buses are over 10% electric vehicle uptake already last year. The motorcycle and PLV sector, which is an often forgot area and actually is critical going forward and clearly has a key role in our transport system of the future. Within the moped sector, almost 20% were zero emission vehicles in year-to-date sales. So that's one of the fastest changing areas. Another key area, taxis. I think year-to-date sales, almost 100% of them are actually electric vehicles, with LEVC obviously providing that product. Even our van sector is starting to change with around 2% so far. But we can't just do it with vehicles and electric vehicles. Fuels, petrol and diesel, year to date are now actually at the maximum saturation levels, if you want to put it that way, that we currently support. And that opportunity for lower carbon fuels has to be grasped more proactively as we go forward. There are still a vast majority of vehicles on the road that are running on combustion fuels, and we need to decarbonize those as much as we need to move to electrification. And of course, electricity itself. The electric vehicle is only as good as the electricity we put into it. And this year there have been records falling aplenty. The one I've picked out here is that our lowest ever electricity carbon intensity was in May this year at 46 grams per kilowatt hour, grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So there's no doubt we have the ability and we have the evidence to show that we can actually exceed some of those expectations that people sometimes refer to. And I think what I wanted to do was really just pick up on that and sort of focus on some of the things that the LowCVP can do. And it's really sort of addressing the questions that have been coming through. And we will take all of these questions and feed them in. But during our work programme, and as we work with the government on the transport decarbonisation programme and the ICE phase-out dates, we're actually there supporting some of these things that have been raised. Information for consumers, a critical aspect. We need smart transport, smart charging, and smart users of that transport. A common vocabulary, that's something we've been focused on, a common vocabulary for the consumers, but also for the industry stakeholders. Discussions around life cycle, what does that mean? You know, what do we mean by electric vehicles? We need to deliver the smart charging, we need to deliver the low carbon fuels, and we've got active programs working in both of those areas. Our EVs are not perfect. We know that there are embedded emissions within the EVs, as indeed there have been life cycle and ILUC questions raised around biofuels. And we have the experience, the knowledge, and the breadth of partnership to actually address these issues very, very proactively and very, very positively. We're looking at the role of hydrogen. Hydrogen has been there in the scheme for many, many years, and it really feels like now its time is coming, particularly in the heavier transport sector. We're seeing hydrogen being one of the great opportunities. And we mustn't forget rural transport. How do we deliver rural solutions, local solutions for local transport needs, and this places agenda that's been spoken about? So we have a great deal of activity that we're carrying out, and we need the partners and we need our members to support us through this as we feed in and support government. I think the last point I wanted to make is back in 2014, E4 Tech carried out a study for us and actually looked at how the low carbon focus that we'd had over the previous 10 years had rejuvenated and actually supported the successful recovery of the automotive industry and a number of other industries around that. And I think we're at that point again in terms of our activity. And importantly, the question was asked about what about transport, what about the transport agenda? One of the questions we did ask is how much is travel going to change? So this reflects, as at last night, the views of our stakeholder community. Well, yes, there is some reduction in travel, but we will still be traveling quite a bit. And we will be reducing perhaps in some areas, but there's possibly even some increases. So travel mobility is a critical piece of our activity. So I think my final position is that you've heard from the Secretary of State, and we are picking up the gauntlet. We will be resetting the LowCVP in 2020. We'll be focused on this new net zero future. But I think more than anything, that principle of partnership and working together and our members are really going to be the key thing that take us forward through the next agenda. I'll hand back to James now, but thank you very much for your support and your continued support, and we'll present more on this survey as we go forward.